Okay, gentlemen. Hopefully this will work. APUS history, as you know, spends a lot of time and thought and energy on themes, storylines that carry us throughout the length of U.S. history. Um, it's not just an accumulation of facts, a lot of names, a lot of dates. You need those. Those are the building blocks. Those are the Legos, if you like. But if they're not put together to build a larger picture, a larger object, you just got a collection of bricks. So you want to think about overarching storylines. And one of the key ones in U.S. history is, of course, immigration and migration. So a few key ideas before we get started here. Always remember, right? Push and pull factors. And by the way, these are the kinds of things you want to make reference to in an essay. You know, you want to talk about, you want to mention somehow. Anyway, push and pull factors. Push factors are those factors that make somebody want to leave a place. Pull factors are those that make them want to come to a certain place. And of course, they work in tandem. If you are a if you are in China in the late 1800s and you're dealing with crop failures and therefore poverty, you're dealing with warlords and violence, you've got a lot of upheaval, that's a push factor to make you want to leave China. Okay, but that doesn't explain why you come to the United States. You have a pull factor that you want to come here. In the 1840s and 50s, 1849 and 50s, it was the gold rush. In the 1870s and 80s, it was the possibility of work on the expanding railroads on the West Coast. And so Chinese people came here. They left China because it just seemed like a lousy place to stay, but they came to America specifically as opposed to someplace else because we offered them some hope of economic advancement. Okay. AP also has a few basic ideas, themes that they like to make reference to. And those are what are here: peopling, identity, environment, geography, ideas, beliefs, and culture, politics and power, work, exchange, and technology, and America and the world. Those are the seven study areas, if you like, that they want to see that you have a grasp of. Clearly, with immigration, migration, peopling is what it's all about. Peopling is simply the term for filling up this land here with human beings and how they got here, why they came here, where they went when they got here, and why, and what sort of mix there was to that. Identity, what does it mean to be an American? And that's not just sort of flag-waving jargon, a nice 4th of July speech, but in a very real sense. We are a constructed country. To be French, well, there's a history there that goes back to before Julius Caesar. There's a language there. Until relatively recently, there was a common religion in Christianity, certainly, and Catholicism specifically. But the United States is a constructed country. Once upon a time, there was nobody here. Way, way back. And then we know the land bridge we'll get to. And then eventually Europeans began to arrive from different places. They had to construct a thing that was an American. And what is the American culture? As we discussed in class, if you sit down and say, oh, well, let's have a real, honest-to-God, good old-fashioned 4th of July, true blue American barbecue. Okay, well, the word barbecue is not English. You're going to have hot dogs and hamburgers, which are, really German. You're bringing in fireworks, which are originally Chinese. we for that morning for breakfast, you probably had bagels, which are, Eastern European Jewish. I mean, what American is not just a mixture, but it's been influenced by these various groups that have come here in various proportions, and we've had to work that out, sometimes in a very difficult way. Also, don't neglect the relationship of immigration and migration to environment and geography. We know that the most powerful factor influencing culture is geography, and human beings are part of the geography. We change the geography. We build artificial rivers. That's what a canal is. We connect places using things like railroads that would not, if you will, naturally be connected. We chop down forests. We dig in the ground for minerals. We affect our environment, and obviously our environment affects us, as we'll see in a little bit. There's a reason why so many immigrants wound up in parts of the Midwest, places like Wisconsin. Who the hell would go to Wisconsin? Well, this is where the farmland was that was similar to the farmland they knew at home. We'll talk about that in a minute. Ideas, beliefs, and culture. Well, it's obvious how immigrants have brought with them ideas, beliefs, and their culture, which have somehow been changed by America. Some of that has been lost, and in turn has changed America, has contributed to our language, if you like. Politics and power. When immigrants come, they are powerless, and they are seeking to participate in the power structures. At the same time, the people who already have the power, the people who are already here, don't want them getting their hands on that, because then that diminishes their own power. Work exchange and technology. The exchange there is the exchange of work for value. I work at a job to make a living. So I am in some sense paid for it. That might be in money. It might in other circumstances be in room and board. Indentured servants are getting a place to stay and passage to the new world, as we'll talk about in a minute. So the relationship of human beings to their work and how the economy works, how the economy goes, what that exchange is certainly a part of the immigrant story. America and the world. That's the theme of America's interaction with the rest of the world. Early on, we were somewhat isolated, although never as isolated as many people seem to think. And certainly the story of immigration, as immigrants come here, yeah, they become Americans, but they keep an eye on back home. And sometimes that becomes a problem. In World War I and World War II, it worried Americans, that these new immigrants, how loyal were they to the country? As we talked about, the United States entry into World War I was delayed for a lot of reasons, one of which is there were an awful lot of people in the United States who were sympathetic to the German side until the Germans basically blew it and forced us to respond. You can argue whether or not we should have gone into the war, but certainly Germany made itself obnoxious to the United States. But before the Zimmerman Note and that unrestricted submarine warfare, you had an awful lot of German immigrants in the United States and immigrants from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it wasn't clear which side of the United States. Well, that's an effect of America's involvement in the world. We should also make sure we remember immigration versus migration. Immigration, is into the country. Emigration with an E is out of the country. Migration is within the country. Note well, as we go forward, America's love-hate relationship with immigration. We pride ourselves on being a nation built on immigrants, built by immigrants, and we have needed immigrants. Without them, our economy couldn't have functioned at many points. But we also fear the influence of immigrants, that it's going to change the country somehow. And so you have this phenomenon that keeps popping up in American history called nativism, which is the fear to the point of hatred and sometimes violence against immigrants by people who are, if you like, native-born Americans, which at different periods in our history has been a significant group of people. I don't know that you could say they were ever a majority, but they were certainly enough to make a great deal of trouble. Also, don't forget internal migrations, which are usually based on economic circumstances. The two most important of these, of course, are the overall migration throughout our history toward the West. From the time of the colonists in Jamestown and the Plymouth Plantation in Massachusetts, people here have been looking to the West. That's where the new land was. When you wore out the land along the East Coast, as they did particularly in the South, with all of that cotton and tobacco planting, they had to look for more and more land. You were always looking farther west for better land. In the North, as more and more people filled up the place, the farmers were looking for new and cheap land they could get that was always a little bit farther out. We moved across the Ohio River Valley to the Mississippi. Jefferson buys the Louisiana Purchase. Slowly that fills up because it was so much of it was so hard to get to. When gold is discovered in 1849, and California, of course, is a huge movement of people out to the coast. They don't necessarily settle in large numbers in between. But that migration toward the West, westward expansion, manifest destiny, and all that goes with it. And from the South to the North, particularly after the Civil War, and in a special way, right around World War I, African Americans in particular, obviously being oppressed in the South and having little hope of economic advancement, they looked to the North. Why? Because that's where industry was booming. And even though in the South, in the post-Civil War period, as you should know from your reading, there's been there was an attempt at some industrialization in the South, the quote new South. It never caught up with the North. And particularly when you get around World War I, when you have a big boom in the lead up to that war, African Americans, they moved to New York, and Cincinnati, and Cleveland, Detroit, and all these industrial cities, hoping to get jobs in the factories there. Okay. Well, let's begin at the very beginning, because all this is migration. Much of it, in some sense, is immigration in the usual sense of the word. So this should all just be a reminder at this point. To begin, between about 10,000 and 40,000 years ago, human beings begin to come across the land bridge from Asia to what's now Alaska and down into the Americas. You don't have to get into too much detail about this, exactly when. They came over in several waves over a period of time. We thought this from the geography and to some degree from archaeology, and DNA, which has only been available for the last few years, has confirmed that Native American peoples came from Asia and they must have come, given the diversity of the DNA and all that, in several different waves over time. They adapted their culture to fit the environment they found as they went, and so you eventually wound up with the eastern woodland Native Americans, the plains Native Americans, the Mayas and the Aztecs down in Central America, adapting what? Adapting to live. And so if your source of food, if you had relatively fertile soil, your source of food became the three sisters. Remember that? The squash, the beans, and the corn. And you became relatively sedentary, relatively settled. If your main source of food wound up being what was available, the buffalo, then you became a hunter tribe, and you wound up becoming nomadic. Okay. How many people were here by the time of Columbus's arrival? We do not know for sure. No census, obviously, no written records. A guess by some historians is 50 to 100 million people. We know that over 90% of the native populations here were wiped out by the arrival of Europeans. Largely as a result of disease, of course, but also as a result of fighting, forced migration where they were pushed off their land and had to move, etc. And just to give you an idea, the population of North and South America together now is over 1 billion. So there are 1,000 times more people in the Americas now than there were, at least 1,000 times, and maybe 2,000 or 3,000 times as many people here now as there were the day Columbus landed. And of course they had hundreds of languages and cultures, which is why you have to be careful when you talk about Native Americans. There is no one Native American culture. There, just like, yeah, to some degree you can talk about Europeans, but we see big differences between, Norwegians and Italians. Well, so much the more there's a difference between the Mohawk and the Iroquois in upstate New York and the Cherokee, originally from Georgia, eventually driven out to the Great Plains. Okay. Colonial period, colonial immigration, if you like. Perhaps better, migration, because we are talking about colonies that were within one country's empire, so it wouldn't technically be immigration from one country to another. First of all, don't forget the Southwest. We tend to get so focused on the English colonies on the eastern seaboard, we forget that Spain, which had colonized Mexico and Central America, actually came up into what's now the American Southwest. Santa Fe, New Mexico, I point out there, was a settlement that existed, was actually settled just about the same time as Virginia. And that's wrong, by the way. That should be 1620. They had explored in the 1500s down there. By around 1610, Santa Fe was already a settlement. The Spanish get along the California coast, kind of move up the California coast in the 1700s. So a lot of those towns out there, what was going to become the missions, the missionary towns that the Spanish Franciscan priests set up, that are now Sacramento, San Francisco, San Diego, Los Angeles, Santa Monica, all named for saints because they were all founded around churches out there. They're all going up in the 1700s, right around the American Revolution. Virginia, 1607. Jamestown down there. Joint stock companies, don't forget, this is how they found them. The headright system You should know that's the system by which a guy could, if you paid for somebody to go from England over to the New Virginia colony, the guy you paid for owed you, usually in the form of an indentured servant, and you yourself got a big parcel of land. That meant that the wealthy wound up picking up a large amount of land out there, and the poor got a chance to come over, but they remained a poor class. The headright system and indentured servitude kind of dies out when the British economy gets better and the poor in England are not so poor that they can't even afford to come to America. So they have to replace them, if you recall, with slaves. And slaves become the largest immigrant group. It's hard to call them immigrants, really, because it's captive immigration. It's enforced at gunpoint, unwilling, involuntary immigration. But they do form, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of slaves that are brought to America, a significant population, although they were kept out of any kind of power. Slave importation slows down eventually in the 1700s. Why? Because you got enough slaves here that you can depend upon trafficking in human beings who are born here. You don't necessarily have to pay to have them brought over on a ship. The U.S. Constitution, 1787, mandates that by 1808 the slave trade into the country ends. Now, that doesn't mean you can't own slaves, and it doesn't mean you can't buy and sell them inside the country. You simply can't import anymore. And since we're talking about immigration, this is of significance to us. Massachusetts, we know, 1620, the Puritans come over. What's the push factor there? Repression, political repression at home, economic depression at home. They were part of the Great English Migration, as it was called, because of the collapse of the economy. Tens of thousands of Englishmen left and went all over the place. Most of them actually went to the Caribbean. It's a minority of them that came to America, but they were part of that. And what are they looking for in America? Well, they're looking to some degree for an economic opportunity. Remember, all of the colonies were always businesses. They were always about running a business. But the Puritans particularly wanted to build a colony that they could run their own way. It's false, as you know, that they were looking to bring religious freedom in any sense we'd recognize. They were not about religious freedom for anybody but themselves. So they wanted to be as oppressive as everybody else, but they wanted to be oppressive in their favor, if you like. New York gets started in 1624 with the Dutch, who come over and settle here. 1664, it's the British. I just mentioned them as we're talking about various Europeans who come over. And the Scots-Irish. 1700s, the Scotch-Irish are coming over to America. The Scotch-Irish are Scotsmen from Scotland who are Protestant. The British had moved them, encouraged them to move from Scotland to Ireland first, in the hope of turning Ireland into a Protestant colony and getting rid of Catholicism. It doesn't work. But some of the Scotch-Irish families now decide to move to America. They're pretty rugged and pretty rough characters, and pretty good at farming. So there's all this new farmland in America. So the early 1700s, they're coming over and settling in on the edges of the American colonies on the Appalachian Mountains. They were always looking for better land and more land and cheaper land. And so they look over the Appalachian Mountains. The other side is, of course, the Ohio River Valley. And they want to get in there. You get the French and Indian War, the end of which is the proclamation line of 1763 that forbids them from entering the land that they just won. That's one of the proximate causes, of course, of the American Revolution. But they largely ignore it, and the Ohio River Valley slowly gets settled to some degree originally by Scots-Irish. We then get the American Revolution, of course, and right after the American Revolution, you've got the French. Not in huge numbers. In none of these cases are we talking about vast numbers. We're talking about thousands, maybe tens of thousands total. Why would the French be coming in the 1790s, 1820s? Well, what do you got going on in France? The Revolution. And a lot of people want out from all of the chaos and the poverty that brings, and violence, of course. You went right, as you know, from the French Revolution, 1789 to about 1799, into the Napoleonic era and the Napoleonic Wars. So really, from the 1790s to about 1820, you have a dribble, not large, but a dribble of French immigration. So let's talk about the United States. Early United States, small but steady numbers of immigrants coming. A trickle are coming over to America. Some Irish, some from other countries in Europe. The French are notable after 1789 during the Revolution, to the point where in 1798, President John Adams gets the Alien and Sedition Act through. We remember the Alien and Sedition Act made it a crime to criticize the government. This was because you had the split between Adams and Jefferson, Adams tending to favor trade and alliance with the British, Jefferson tending to favor trade and alliance with the French. And the fear was that the French would use their immigration to start to influence the U.S. government. And so the Alien and Sedition Act was meant as a way that gave the president the right to put French immigrants in general, but what it meant was French immigrants in jail, particularly if they were seen to be any kind of a threat to the United States. That is eventually repealed, but we don't make laws against things that aren't happening, if you will. Nobody makes a law, as I've told you guys, against bashing yourself in the head with a brick. Why not? Because nobody does it. They're making the Alien Sedition Act law because there is French immigration. It tells you that there's enough of it there that they're looking around and it's making them nervous. Maybe it shouldn't have made them nervous, but it tells you that there's enough of an influence there for it to be noticeable. Okay. Beginning in 1820, immigration really starts to take off. The Napoleonic Wars are over by that time. They really end in 1815. The British, because the Napoleonic Wars are over, and there's a lot of reform going on in Britain itself, they begin to ease off on their travel restrictions, so they start to allow the Irish to leave Ireland if they want. And therefore you get some emigration out of Ireland. And the United States is beginning to take off, too, as an economic power. The Erie Canal begins construction in 1817. By the 1820s, it's really becoming functional. And so you are beginning to get, in the United States, those factories, the Lowell factories and so on up in Massachusetts, Lowell, you should know what that is. Um, the Midwest is beginning to fill up, or what was then called the West, meaning Ohio, with the Erie Canal there, allowing trade. And so you begin to get a little more immigration from Europe from a number of different places. Of course, the real astronomical rise comes in the 1840s. Potato famine, 1844, and the years following, and then you have generations of Irish who just leave because the poverty just doesn't go away in Ireland. And the more freely the British allow the Irish to go, the more they take advantage of it. So once Irish immigration starts in the 1840s, it doesn't really end. It keeps going right into the 20th century. 1848, and in Germany and other Central European countries, you had a series of failed revolutions to bring a kind of democracy and republics there. When those collapsed, a lot of people decided to get out. And industrial expansion in the United States by the 1840s and 50s. We're getting closer to the Civil War, but we're also getting a lot of those new inventions, the beginnings of better metallurgy, so steel making and that sort of thing. You're about to see the railroads are expanding, and so there's a lot of opportunity in the United States. And Europeans begin to look around and say, our economy here is a mess. Look what they have over there. Anybody can make it in America. Anybody can own land in America, which was not true in Europe, right? You had to basically be born into the landowning class. And so 1840s and 50s, you begin to see immigration really take off. Well, that's going to lead to a reaction. The famous "No Irish Need Apply," where all over America, wherever there were Irish immigrants, particularly in big cities like New York, they would put in the window of the shop or the store or the restaurant, "Help wanted, but no Irish need apply. If you're Irish, don't bother," because they just wouldn't accept you. This is the great era, 1840s and 50s, of the first sort of burst, if you like, of nativism. A political party called the American Party, but as you know, the nickname was the Know Nothing Party, because if you asked a member about, the party, it was a big secret, and he would say, "I know nothing." It also had a sort of, I should fix this, a sort of a secret subgroup called the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner, which was, a little bit like the Klan. It was a gang with secret handshakes and secret passwords, but they would get together and they would intimidate or beat up immigrants. They'd convince people not to hire immigrants and so on. This was not a small movement. 1856, they ran Millard Fillmore, who had been president before under the Whig Party. They ran him in 1856 for president. He does not win, of course, but he makes a credible showing. And there were a lot of places, including, for instance, Staten Island, that had a significant know-nothing community. And although they don't win the presidency, there are a lot of city councilmen and state senators and so on that get elected with know-nothing backing. Nativism kind of fails, though. First of all, the sheer numbers of immigrants begin to overwhelm them. New York City really becomes an immigrant town. It's hard to find a block that doesn't have immigrants in it, or a business that's not dependent on them. And so as the wealthier classes become dependent on, for instance, the Irish and Germans in New York to work for them, those in political power kind of back off the nativism. The poorer classes kind of lose the argument. And when the Civil War comes along in 1860, many of these immigrants fight. Now, I say many there, in parentheses, not all. As we know, you had the draft riots in New York, which was a strong anti-war, anti-union riot, mostly of Irish immigrants, fearing that if we fight to free the slaves are just going to come and take the few jobs we have in a city where they're still discriminated against. But when the war is over, when you get into the 1870s and so on, I'm not saying that everybody had a sudden change of heart, but it was hard to call a guy not a true American when, he had taken a bullet at Gettysburg. So these Irish, the Irish who fought in the Irish regiments, the Germans who fought in the German regiments, it kind of established them to a degree as real Americans, if you want. After the Civil War, Germans and Irish continue. Once German and Irish immigration starts, it never goes away, and they remain in the top tier of countries sending immigrants to the United States right into the 20th century. But you begin to get other groups. First, let's talk about the Asians briefly. Chinese had begun coming over with the gold rush. China had had a collapse in its crops, a series of famines in China, bad weather, and so on. There was violence and fighting and warlords running around China. So there were a lot of people who, again, wanted out. And China was also a very hierarchical society, as you know. So the possibilities for advancement were pretty limited. When gold is discovered on the West Coast, it, seems like an opportunity. They do come over and they prospect, but they also are smart enough to take advantage of the guys who come out for the gold rush. I don't mean take advantage in a negative way, but if you have all of these guys who suddenly come out to California, well, they're going to need places to stay. They're going to need places to eat. They're going to have places to, clean their clothes and buy supplies. And so a lot of the Chinese either go to work as laborers for these guys, or they go to work in sort of what we would call service industries today. When the gold rush obviously doesn't pan out, and pan out, by the way, is a metaphor that comes to us from the gold rush. You scooped up a bunch of silt from the bottom of the river in a big wide pan and swirled around in water and let the sort of dust fall to the bottom and see if there was any gold flecks in it. That was what it meant to pan out gold from the river. Anyway, when the gold rush doesn't really amount to much for the vast majority of people, the Chinese continue to come because they get work as laborers on the new expanding railroads. Well, that, once again, when you get a big rush of people like that, people get nervous. 1882, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is the first real attempt at cutting down on immigration. You have to realize, until the Chinese Exclusion Act, we had not, it was really almost impossible to be an illegal immigrant. There were no rules. You showed up in the United States, they stamped your papers and you were in. And there really wasn't much restriction on it. So excluding anybody was the first time we had done it, and we excluded them on pure racial lines. We excluded an ethnic group because of political pressure from the West Coast. It was workers in California, Oregon, and that area put political pressure on Washington, D.C., and the federal government to shut down the immigration. Japanese came a little bit later. They started coming in large numbers in 1890s, around 1900. And they too were coming. They're coming from Asia, so it's obvious they're going to stay on the West Coast. They too were feared. And so you had segregation on the West Coast. You had Oregon and California were putting in these laws having separate school facilities for Japanese versus not, European descent Americans. It was exactly the same kind of segregation you got to get against blacks in the 1950s in the South. What to do about that? Japan was furious about this because Japan, by the early 1900s, was beginning to become a world power, and they believed that their people, immigrants though they were, should be treated with some dignity and respect. Teddy Roosevelt, this is Theodore Roosevelt, and we should specify that, I guess. This is 1907. Brokers what was known as the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan. And Roosevelt basically promised that he would put pressure on the Western states to back off the legal discrimination. You couldn't stop, people from segregating, if you like, informally, not wanting Japanese in their business or not wanting to live in a Japanese neighborhood. But Roosevelt would put pressure on the governments there to make sure that you didn't pass laws mandating segregation. In return, Japan promised to cut down the number of visas it issued to its own people to go to America. So basically, instead of the Chinese Exclusion Act, the United States said, we will not accept Chinese. The Gentleman's Agreement, we talked Japan into saying, we're not going to allow you to go to America if you want to. We're going to keep you home. However, there was a workaround. Hawaii. Remember Hawaii? The United States has gotten its hands on Hawaii around the time of the Spanish-American War. Our acquisition of Hawaii had nothing to do whatever with the Spanish-American War. It just happened to occur at the same moment. We talked about that a little bit in class, and you should know it from your book. Hawaii was then a territory of the United States. It remained a territory, not a state, until the late 1950s, 1958. So Japan would allow its people to go to Hawaii, and some of them then would go from Hawaii to California, because once you're in the territory, then it's easier to get to the United States, you see. Which is why, to this day, Hawaii has a significant Japanese descent population there, and many Japanese families that live on the West Coast trace their descent from immigrants first to Hawaii. In all these cases, though, we should note that Asians were given a particularly difficult time, legally and otherwise, as immigrants. Okay, let's continue. Post-Civil War. We should also note the 14th Amendment. Two things to note about that. As you remember from Dred Scott, the Dred Scott case, in the Dred Scott case, Roger Taney said clearly no black man has any rights that any white man need pay attention to, and said specifically that a black man, slave or not, could not be a citizen, that there was no such thing as a black human being who was a citizen of the United States. Well, the 14th Amendment said anybody born in the United States is a citizen, including ex-slaves. That not only gives the ex-slaves citizenship, it also means that now Africans can immigrate to the United States as much as or as little as anybody else. And so an African immigrant can also legally apply for citizenship. It's a small thing, but it's worth noticing. Also worth noticing is that birthright citizenship. The 14th Amendment clarifies that you get to be an American citizen if you are born in the United States. That's what it says. Which is an issue that we have even today. And so it clarifies that issue of law. Okay. Post-Civil War, we talked about the Asian immigration. Let's get back to Europe. So who do you have coming over? Well, 1880s, you begin to get a massive Italian influx. What happened? Italy had been a busted up bunch of city-states up through the 1860s. In the 1860s, Giuseppe Garibaldi had put together, he had fought a revolution with a guy named, with political figures like a guy named Mazzini and a guy named Cavour, who you should know from European. And in the 1860s and early 1870s, they had fought a war to unify Italy. So instead of there being the Kingdom of Piedmont in the north and the Naples in the south, the Kingdom of the two Sicilies and all this kind of business, and the Papal States in the middle, they had unified it into a single country, so that by 1871, Italy was one country. Hooray. Except it didn't really turn out to help the economy much of the poorest people. A lot of the peasants in Italy thought that this was going to be the start of a new economic age for them, and it isn't really. The land was all owned by a landowning class. The average Joe in Italy was very similar to the sharecropping system of the African Americans in America. He was getting a lousy deal. And so it's in that time, the 1880s, up through the 1920s, that Italians in large numbers come to the United States. So much so that the Italians are really the biggest target of this. 1920s, the United States passes a series of laws that we'll talk about in a minute. But the Emergency Quota Act, the Immigration Act of 1924, and the National Origins Quota, those essentially shut down immigration from Southern Europe, meaning Italy, Greece, and a couple of other countries. It really shuts down immigration to a great degree to the United States altogether. But the real target of it, or one of the key targets, were the Italians. 1880s, you also have massive Eastern European Jewish immigration. You had a series of pogroms. Pogroms, you should know, are these attacks, ethnic cleansing, we call it today, on Jewish communities. So the Cossacks, who was this Russian ethnic group, would come charging into a Jewish village, because over in Eastern Europe, you had Jewish villages and Christian villages, and they didn't really have much to do with each other. They go charging into the Jewish village, hack the place up, set everything on fire, beat up a few people, sometimes kill a bunch of people. It was pretty rough. And the Tsar was no help. There's a long history of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, and the Tsar was kind of backing a lot of this. So a lot of Jews from the countries that today we call Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, Hungary, places like that begin to come over. Similarly, I won't get into all the stories on all of them. Scandinavia, so you have late 1800s, you have a large number of immigrants from Norway, Finland, Sweden. They come over. There's a lot of political upheaval up there, and really a kind of series of economic problems up there. Greece, and so on. This gets you to the Immigration Act of 1882. Immigration Act, now if we go back for a minute, we talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act. That shut down Chinese immigration in 1882. The Immigration Act of 1882 that we're talking about here is another law which began to put restrictions on who could enter the country. You weren't allowed to come into the United States if you were a convict, if you had mental illness, if you could not, in the judgment of an immigration officer, support yourself, if you had a communicable disease, etc. And so you get Ellis Island and Angel Island. Angel Island, of course, is the Ellis Island of the West Coast, San Francisco, and immigration inspectors. And so when you came in off the boat, the immigration inspectors would give you a medical exam. They would question you about your country of origin and why you're coming to the United States, and do you know anybody here? And if in their judgment, you could not support yourself, or you seemed hinky, there was something that seemed unsavory about you, they could send you back. In fact, despite all the stories about, how many people were turned away, it was very few. It was a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of people that got turned away at these places. But it was a humiliating system, and it was insensitive at times. A lot of people got their names changed famously at Ellis Island. If the immigration officer couldn't spell your name, he would spell it any way he felt like it, and that became your name. When I went to college, I had one of my close friends was a kid named Tim Dilligan, Dilligan, which obviously is an Irish name. Well, no, he's Lithuanian, but they had no idea how to spell whatever his real Lithuanian name is that's been lost to history, so they guessed and they came up with that. That was common at the time. Okay. Well, all of these new immigrants in the 1880s, 90s, 1900, how do we handle them? As we talked about, they bring with them problems of, what does it mean to be an American? How do they assimilate? How do we make them part of our culture? Do we make them part of our culture? Do they become part of us, or do we adapt to them? They're going to have trouble getting jobs. They're going to have trouble adapting to American customs. A lot of these people are coming from real old country, a village in Poland where guys and girls didn't date. Families arranged marriages. And, the concept of a woman being out on her own or having a job was something they couldn't wrap their heads around, where they had traditional ways of cooking and cleaning and keeping house that didn't fit in America. What do we do about this? How do we help these people not fall into poverty? Okay, well, there were a couple of approaches. One that you should know of is the settlement house movement. And the most famous of these, the first of these, is Hull House, which was in Chicago. Maybe I should point that out, right? And in New York, you had, I'll put in the Henry Street Settlement. That's not right. Jane Addams is the woman there. She is the first of the Settlement House people, and it goes back to 1889. So you see the time period. The Henry Street Settlement still exists today in New York. The Hull House is still there. What is the point of the Settlement House? Well, the idea of it supposedly is to reach out to people with help. The Settlement House was a place where immigrants who were constantly being ripped off, victimized, conned, right, overcharged, and put down by the people around them, they could go to the Settlement House, and it was a safe, honest, reliable place where they could get some education, where their children would be taken care of. They'd get some daycare and that sort of thing. There was some recreational opportunities there, social services if they needed child care, if they needed some medical care, they would work something out for them. It was run by, if you like, Native Americans. It was run by non-immigrants as a way to reach out to immigrants to help them out and give them a hand getting settled in the new country. Okay. What was the Settlement House movement really about, though? I in no way want to portray these people as sneaky or anything. They weren't. But somewhere in the back of their head was the assumption that what they needed to do was help these people become Americanized. So the Settlement House movement was not only a way to give them, as I said, child care, social services, education, some healthy, safe recreation. It was also a way to help them understand what American life was and to sort of buy into it. Yeah. What other things do we have to handle it? Well, ethnic things, ethnic parishes, societies, and clubs. What do I mean by that? Catholic Church started parishes specifically for ethnic groups. And as we talked about, that's why in Little Italy you have a parish in every block, because you needed a parish not for Italians, but for Genoese, for Neapolitans, for northern Sicilians and southern Sicilians and Milanese, because the language is different, the customs are different, the favorite saints are different, the feast days that they make a big deal about are different. And the ethnic parishes it's not just that they had Mass, or Mass was, of course, in Latin in those days, but that they had prayers and confessions and stuff in their native language. But they also provided other kinds of help. Some of you may have grandparents and stuff that are still in these organizations, the St. Anthony Society, the Mount Carmel Society. A lot of those are burial societies, which may seem weird, but it was actually a kind of life insurance. So when you join the St. Anthony Society, everybody put in $1 every week or something. There was some tiny little amount of dues you had. And then if one of the members had a family member who died, the rest of the society would take care of the funeral arrangements. Well, funerals were expensive then, as they are now, and an unexpected expense, and not something you can put off. And so if you were the average little, worker, you would have a hard time. But because you were part of the society, it was kind of like an insurance group. Everybody kicked in money, and then you could take out when you needed. It helped people out. They had similar things for, when you got injured or your kid got in trouble. So there were actual economic aspects to a lot of these things. It also helped you meet other people. And that was really important, particularly for young people. It wasn't like today where everybody hangs out with everybody else. if you were a young guy and you were looking around for a nice girl to be a wife and a mom to your kids someday, how were you going to meet her if you were working 14 hours a day? Well, on Saturday nights, the parish would have a dance, and all the, teenagers and 20-somethings would go, and under supervision, so everything was nice and above board, and, you could meet people. Similarly with ethnic societies and ethnic clubs, the Germans were very big on this. The Germans loved clubs. They were called Vereins, Vereins, which means basically a club. They had you don't need to know the German on this, but the Turnvereins, which was gymnastics clubs. So it was basically the equivalent of joining a gym now. They had singing societies. Germans are very big on music. It's not a surprise that Beethoven and Mozart and Bach are all Germans. And a lot of our hymns in church come from German hymns. So they love these singing societies. They had Schutzvereins, which were shooting societies. They were hunting groups, and they would have target practice and that sort of thing. They were mostly, though, opportunities to socialize and to get together and to talk and to network. You're looking for a job. I'll tell you this, guys, this is a good thing to know. For all of the websites out there you put your resume up on and all the rest of it, the way most people get really good jobs is they got a friend who's got a friend who knows somebody. And if you're a young guy looking for a job and there's another guy in your club who mentions, hey, they're hiring at my factory, that was how people got along. So that's kind of positive stuff. But the immigrants themselves were faced with this difficult problem of, do we preserve our culture or do we assimilate? Now, what do I mean? There's nothing more fundamental to a person than their religious beliefs. And I know a lot of you guys will probably try to figure out what those are for yourselves. That's okay. But what you believe the point of life is, what you believe it means to be a good person, where your morality comes from, this is fundamental to people. And so when you've grown up in an Eastern European village where everybody in town is Russian Orthodox or Jewish, or a town in Italy where everybody is Catholic, and that's just where the atmosphere you grow up in, where the Ten Commandments are kind of built into what you do, and contributing to the charity to the poor is kind of part of what you do, and going to church on Sunday is kind of what you do. When you come to America, has such a mix-mash of things. There's a different kind of church on every block, and not yours. And there are people who aren't religious at all. You go into these towns on a Sunday morning over Europe, in those days, not anymore. You went around on a Sunday morning, there was nobody in town because everybody was in church. It wasn't like that in New York. What does that mean? And parents are worried their kids are going to lose their sense of values. But they want them to be real Americans at the same time. How do we do this? Jewish people. This was kind of a famous example. There were, to be Jewish in Europe was kind of one thing. And you went to synagogue on Saturday, and you ate certain food, and you dressed a certain way, and that's what it was. They come to America, and they are a tiny minority. And a lot of the Jewish people didn't know how to deal with this. Some of them clung to those traditions, and as we've mentioned in class, the Hasidim in Brooklyn, they dress in that funny way because that's how Jewish people in Eastern Europe dressed in the 1800s. And they don't, they're afraid of losing that. If we start to water that down, what happens next? We lose the whole thing. So they want to cling to that and kind of say to the world, hey, this is who we are. You have to accept us. We don't have to change to fit you. There's something admirable in that. But it's in America that you also get other Jewish people who start holding services on Sunday mornings, not Saturday. Why? Well, because all their neighbors do it Sunday morning and they don't want to look different. And they're afraid if they look too different, they'll get persecuted just like they did back at home. And you can understand their concern. And so you begin to get what we call now Reform Judaism, which looks very much like sort of generic Protestantism. That's the kind of thing that they're stuck with. And as I talked about in class, do you keep your kids speaking Italian at home so they don't lose that identity of who they are? Or do you force them to speak English because my kid's going to be a real American and not be discriminated against because he's got an accent? Economic power is at stake here. Political power. Politics was controlled by the people with the money and the people who were in office and the people who had been here longest. And immigrants, it's only when the big city political machines, and you should know what the political machines are from your textbook, it's only when the machines begin to really figure out that the immigrants represent a huge untapped source of votes, that they begin to reach out to the immigrants. And you begin to get Irish cops and firemen getting jobs. We talked about that in class a bit. And then you begin to see Irish and Germans being elected, city councilmen and assemblymen, sort of lower level political jobs, as the big bosses realize we've got to give some of that away to keep the Germans and the Irish voting for us. By the time you get to the early 20th century, depending on what neighborhood you were in New York City, depending on the neighborhood, your city councilman might be Jewish or Italian, which was the political machine at the time. Who were the most numerous in New York by then? The Irish. So the Irish would give away a city council seat here or an assembly seat there to get the loyalty to the Democratic Party, which was the main party in New York, of the new immigrant groups. And defining what success is. What does it mean to be successful in this new country? Having money is great. If I've forgotten who I am I still a success? Or is being successful fully becoming so American that nobody notices the difference between me and anybody else? That's a kind of struggle they deal with. As I point out, as this immigration heats up, Statue of Liberty comes along in 1875 as a gift from the French, and becomes the symbol of America as place of immigration. That wasn't really the purpose of the Statue of Liberty. Statue of Liberty was meant as a commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the United States. 1876, you can see the centennial, right? So the French, who had helped us win the war, figure, okay, we'll give you this Statue of Liberty enlightening the world. Because just like the French had their revolution for liberty, they shared that with the Americans. When the Statue of Liberty goes up, it goes up in New York Harbor and goes up next to Ellis Island. And so, for millions of immigrants, it was the first thing they saw when they came to America. Immigrants from Europe came through New York, and when they came into New York Harbor, the first thing they saw was the Statue of Liberty, and that's when they knew they were, in fact, truly, actually in America. And you can see the Statue of Liberty, it's right next to it, from all over Ellis Island. That's how the Statue of Liberty becomes the symbol of immigration. It's not built as the symbol of immigration. It becomes it because the immigrants themselves begin to identify with it. And then Emma Lazarus writes her famous poem, "Give me your tired, your poor, your wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." She writes that poem independently of all of that, and it becomes the kind of meaning of the statue. Yet, while we're doing that, nativism, discrimination, still very much alive in the 1880s, 1890s. You go back and read the New York Times from around 1900 and what they have to say about the Italians and how they are going to change American culture and water down what this country means. Pretty horrifying. Okay, World War I comes along. And as you can guess, powerful anti-German feelings. Once the United States makes the decision to enter the war, anything German is suspect. And as I mentioned in class, or at least in one period, you didn't have sauerkraut anymore. You had to call it victory cabbage. Yeah, you didn't have hamburger anymore. You had to call it Salisbury steak. Salisbury is a British name. Nobody wanted to, Germans themselves changed their last names so they would sound less German. It was made illegal in some places to teach the German language in public schools. It was a common second language in a lot of schools, the way, you have French and Italian and so on here. There was a real sort of anti-German hysteria. The American Protective Association, the APA, was this government-sponsored vigilante group. It was a private organization that the U.S. Department of Justice officially endorsed. And the point of the APA was that they were snooping on all the neighbors. And they were quite open about it. This was not like sort of on the sly. The APA went around and if they thought anybody in the neighborhood was too pro-German or too anti-war, they would turn them in to the Department of Justice as suspect. The United States put thousands of German Americans into prison camps as enemy aliens. Woodrow Wilson, as how do I put it, as progressive as he was, authorized putting American citizens whose grandparents were German immigrants into camps if they were deemed to be suspect enemy aliens. Well, that certainly creates a kind of fear of immigrants, of Germans specifically, but makes all immigrants kind of suspect. 1920s, you then get, right after, or actually before the war, early 1900s, 19-teens, and into the 20s, a Red Scare. The Red Scare of the 1950s that you may know about, this is before that, where the fear is that these Eastern Europeans, Poles, Russians, and so on, with their Bolshevik, communist, revolutionary ways, they were all suspect. And so I should point out the Attorney General of the United States is a guy by the name of A. Mitchell Palmer. And the Palmer raids were raids that the Attorney General authorized to round up, basically wholesale, Eastern European immigrants that people thought were a little suspect, to ship them off. In the 1920s, you get the immigration acts that I was mentioned before. that largely shut down immigration. So let's just go back for a minute and talk about those immigration acts. Okay. Nope. Okay. So the Emergency Quota Act, the Immigration Act of 1924, and the National Origins Quota, all of them, here's what they do in short. They restrict the number of immigrants coming into the United States as a percentage of the number of immigrants, as the number of people who claim descent from those immigrants already here. Okay, which has just confused the hell out of you. So in other words, because Germans had been the largest immigrant groups to the United States, and so therefore you had the largest number of German descendants in the United States, therefore Germany got the largest number of immigrants that were allowed to enter the United States starting in the 1920s. Same thing with the Irish. Because the Italians were relative newcomers, they got a much smaller quota of people that were allowed in. Yeah, so the more people you already had here, the more people you were allowed to bring in, the fewer people you had. So that essentially, since there were not that many German immigrants by the time you get to the 20s and 30s, it really puts a big dent in immigration. The Immigration Acts of the 1920s started to shut down immigration because Americans were becoming more and more fearful of having these immigrants around, and you're beginning to hear not, we need the immigrants here to work, and more, we have to shut down immigration because they're going to start competing for jobs with us. Of course, then the Great Depression happens, and the Depression is worldwide. So nobody's got the money to buy a ticket to come to America, nor is there any reason to. If you can't get a job in Germany, you're not going to find one in America, so what's the point? World War II, of course, completely shuts down immigration from Europe because there's a war on and nobody's crossing the Atlantic and they're going to get torpedoed. Similarly from Asia. You do get some from South America. The United States needed workers badly. Every able-bodied male was either in the United States military or was working in a factory that was making munitions for the United States military. So were all the women. Well, we needed a lot more workers, particularly for agricultural work. And so you have this Bracero program. The Bracero program starts in 1942 and it goes into the 1960s. It was a guest worker program. Several 100,000 Mexicans were intentionally brought into the country so that they could work in harvesting vegetables and food and stuff on the farms around the country. They were rather terribly treated. There were laws that were supposed to protect them. They were supposed to be given a decent wage. There was supposed to be a bank account set up for them so that when they went back to Mexico, which was the point, they were going to come work for a period of time and then go back, that bank account would be there with their money in it, that they would then not be ripped off, if you like. They were supposed to be given by the farmers that were hiring them, and we're talking about large industrial farms. They were supposed to be given decent housing, decent food, so, you know, you were going to get a bunk in a dormitory, you would get 3 square meals a day. Well, a lot of those promises were not kept. A lot of the farmers treated them pretty badly. We're talking about a few 100,000 people, not millions. They came, they worked. Some of them went back home. Some of them stayed in America. They simply chose to stay here. And so we have a lot of Latinos in the United States, particularly in the Midwest and Southwest, who are legal Americans and are descendants of the Braceros. Well, the immigration acts of the 1920s were revised in 1952. the quotas were fiddled with a bit, particularly to help out Asians, because Asians were still effectively excluded. Since the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Japanese had been effectively excluded as well, as we talked about, the quotas of the 1920s had given them almost no quota because there were so few of them here already. That's how the quota worked. So they changed the quotas a little bit to help some of the Asian countries out, but it was still pretty restrictive. 1965, the Immigration Nationality Act changes all of this. Instead of this quota system, they set up a simple per-country limit. So it was specific to the country, and they really put the emphasis on if you already had family here, you could come, or if you had a special skill that was needed in the United States that there were not enough of, a particular kind of engineer or something, and we just didn't have enough to fill our needs, you could come. And even though we've made adjustments of various kinds to that Immigration Nationality Act of 1965, it still remains the basic law that we are under now. Okay, I want to just look at a few statistical charts with you for a few minutes. You may get statistical charts as documents, and it also enlightens us about certain of the things about immigration here. So, immigration before 1790. This is the total population of such people by 1790. You can see that the largest number of Americans in 1790 are 2,100. I mean, excuse me, 2,100,000. I'm losing my mind here. So obviously England is the biggest group, of course. Well, it's their colonies that we had just become free. But look at this. Africa, 757,000. So 750,000 people in the United States were from Africa or descendant from Africans. That's astounding, given that they are by far the largest group otherwise. Yeah. The Scots-Irish, we see 300,000. They were the ones that were on the borders that had been looking to go out to the Ohio Valley. Germany, 270,000. They dominated Pennsylvania. The Germans were mostly in Pennsylvania, and we know that Pennsylvania almost made German its official language. And, okay, so on. Now, this is interesting. Population and foreign born, 1790 to 1849. So how many immigrants came into the country in the decade beginning 17, or the decade, I guess, ending 1790? We're talking 60,000. Now, these are estimates. But you can see 1790, 1800, 1810, 1820, you're talking about 60,000 immigrants in a decade. That's a pretty small number. So they're dribbling in. That's 6,000 people a year. Decade ending 1830, so 1820 to 1830, you have 143,000. By 1840, you've got 600,000. Now, what's gone on? The Erie Canal is now fully open and operational, and you're beginning to get all of that industrialization happening. 1840 to 1850, now we start to really bust out. Now you go from 600,000 to 3 times that many, 1.7 million, because 1844, you started to get Irish immigration from the famine. 1848, you start to get people fleeing the revolutions in Central Europe. Okay, and this is also an interesting number here. You've gone from a tiny percentage of people who are foreign-born, 1.5%, to almost 10% of Americans are now born outside of the United States by 1850. Watch. Okay, now let's just take a look at this for a minute. This is kind of an interesting thing. 1830, 50, 80, 1900, 1930, 1960, 1970. So you see it skips around a bit. 1830, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 1900. But what's important here is this. In order, this is a list of how many people, or I should say, how many thousands of people came from that particular country to the United States in each of these census years. And to get listed, you have to be in the top 10. What does that mean? That means Germany makes it into the top 10 of countries with people in the United States, 1, 2, 3, 4, every one of these time periods. Canada makes it into the top 10 of people entering the United States. China, top 10 only in 1880, and then in 1882 it gets shut down. Yeah? Okay, now let's just take a look at something here. Let's move this down a bit. Ireland, you can see, top 10 up through 1960. Italy hits the top 10 in 1900 and up into 1930, 60. So even with the quotas trying to shut them down, they're still coming. If we look at Russia, that's 1900 there, 1930. Poland makes it in 1930. That's after the revolution is going on there. So you can see how many people are coming and how dominant Germany and Ireland were for so many years with those numbers. Now, let's take a look at some total numbers here. The percentage of foreign-born, 1830, that's an estimate. Okay, by 1850, it's, as we said, 10%, and it's going up 13, and then starts to come down again, foreign-born, as we tighten up on immigration. So that's an interesting number to look at. I just thought I'd show you a couple of these statistics here. Also, here's an interesting set of statistics. Not so much a statistic, I mean an interesting image. So this is a greeting card, a Happy New Year, and down here you see in Hebrew it says L'Shana Tova, so that's good, lucky New Year, Happy New Year. And this is obviously a greeting card from for the Jewish New Year. And here you see the Russian Imperial Eagle, and here are the folks back in Russia, and you see, they're looking kind of bedraggled and carrying their stuff in, a pillowcase here and looking kind of a mess. And here are their American cousins beckoning them to come across, waving them to come over. And there's the American Eagle above them. And notice how snappily dressed they are. Brand new suits, nice hats, nice dresses, derbies, and all that. This was a greeting card from late 1800s, about around 1890, I think. And you can see sort of the propaganda they were telling themselves. They would have sent this back home to, they might have sent this back home to the folks back there, and, hey, come to America, it's great. This is the kind of thing people really did run into. May 28th, 1888, the city council, this would have been, passed a resolution to the effect that parties receiving the contract for paving East Washington Street shall bind themselves not to employ any Italian labor. No Italians wanted. The whitewashing and papering of Hackett and Keefe's saloon. Whitewashing was, it's sort of white paint. It was cheap white paint. And papering, that is wallpapering. So Hackett and Keefe's saloon is redecorating. Will be given to the lowest bidder. Bids will be in sealed proposals and not to exceed $13. So the balance in whiskey. So if you got the job to wallpaper the saloon, the most they'd pay you is $13 and a bottle of whiskey. No Irish need apply. This is one of the most famous political cartoons of the period. This is from the late 1800s. And the American River Ganges, so the sacred river, it's a guy named Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast is famous for having invented the picture of Santa Claus as we think of him. So he's a nice guy, right? Except not so much. Here you bravely have an American Protestant kid bravely protecting his little American Protestant children who are on their knees fearing death, and they're trying to save them from this. This is back here a public school with an American flag. And what do you see here? If you look closely, see that? That's a face there. That's a bishop's hat. So he's taken bishops on their hands and knees and turned them into crocodiles. Catholic bishops, crocodiles who are trying to eat the American children and destroy our great land, etc. Here you've got a political cartoon, 1882. The Regular Ticket Working Man's Party of California. That was a political party, a local political party out in California. The Chinese must go, and the Working Man's Party of California is kicking the poor Chinese guy out of California and back to China. Here's a good graphic that gives you an idea of the effects of the immigration laws we've talked about. This does not include the Asian countries because after 1882, the number of Asian immigrants was minuscule that was allowed into the country. But immigrants from Northwestern Europe, immigrants from Southeastern Europe. So this is really Italy and Greece. This, of course, is France, Germany, Scandinavia. So 1881 to 1890, you see it's mostly Northern European and some from the South. 1891, it really picks up, and now you got all of these in here. This is mostly Italian immigrants. By early 1900, 3/4 of the immigrants are coming from Southern Europe, Greece, Italy, but Italy significantly. Keep it up, and then we start to put in those immigration quotas, and all of a sudden, we've knocked this down to this and this. That doesn't mean you still had some immigrants coming in, but far, far fewer. So you can see, that if you're asked how effective was it, you can say it didn't totally shut down immigration from Eastern Europe, but it did cut immigration overall, and it significantly cut the percentage of immigrants from Southeastern Europe. Okay, there's A. Mitchell Palmer out for a stroll. This is from the Chicago Tribune. So Chicago, a very immigrant town, particularly Eastern European immigrants. A lot of people from Russia, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, that kind of area. And you can see this is kind of mocking him. There's A. Mitchell Palmer, that Attorney General, out for a stroll, and all he sees all around him are Reds. He's got, these are all guys with like Trotsky, Russian revolutionary kind of beards on them, even the baby. this kind of speaks for itself, except I will tell you that this is not from the Second World War. Photograph is from the very early 1920s, and from the West Coast in California. So this is well before the United States is at war with them. And I'll show you just one more. This is also from the 1880s. And there's Uncle Sam in the middle. And there's Chinese guy and the Pacific back here, and the railroads. And on the East Coast, this is an Irishman. That's a typical depiction of what they thought the Irish looked like. That sort of guerrilla look to them with the weird hat. And this is what people thought. Uncle Sam will be swallowed by foreigners. Okay, that's it for this one.